Hello everyone, this is Shannon from That's So Po, and today I'm here with my husband Sush.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking about the Hugo novel shortlist today and sort of giving our thoughts and our rankings. So we'll be going through the 6 different novels that are on the shortlist and talking about them in my ranking order. Sush has a somewhat different ranking, so he'll talk about that whenever we kind of talk about a book and what his ranking is.
First up, we have Nona the Ninth by Tamsyn Muir, and this is the third book in the Locked Tomb trilogy, which started with Gideon the Ninth and continued to Harrow the Ninth. In this book, we encounter a new character called Nona, who is either 19 years old or 6 months old, depending on if you're talking about physical age or mental age. She came into existence, according to what she remembers, only about 6 months back, and she's going through an accelerated mental aging process. And there's a number of characters that we've encountered in previous books who are trying to take care of her and trying to help her retrieve her memories, such as it is. And basically, what's happening here is Nona's her personality is what makes this book shine. She is very innocent, she's eager to please, she thinks a lot of the adults around her are super cool in different ways, and basically, and if you can kind of think about the setting, this is set in an area that feels like it could be revolutionary France or post Soviet collapse in Warsaw Pact countries kind of areas. And so there's this, grim, brutal outdoors, where there's this feeling of something ominous, something significant about to happen. And here she is going, I'm going to school, and, excited about life and things like that. So it's an utterly charming book to read. And there's also an aspect of, and then we kind of told this pretty much right at the beginning, which is that she might be Gideon, or she might be Nona, or some combination thereof, and we have no idea who she is or why she is significant. Okay, and so that also throws into a lot of, it's like, what's going on kind of a things. And to a large extent, I read through about 30% of this book before stopping for a little while, then going and watching a whole bunch of videos on YouTube, which are like half an hour to an hour long, of what happened in books 1 and 2. I have read books 1 and 2, but this is to remind myself of a lot of details. It's like, is this all just completely new to me? So trying to kind of remind myself of a lot of things that happen. And, it helps a little, but only a little. So I feel like this is one of those things where you normally say you can't discuss what happens in the third book of a series. Here you could do that without spoiling books 1 and 2, I feel like. Nevertheless, I will not go into more detail, just in case. This book is a mixture of mystery in a sense, but in mysteries you like to play along, trying to solve what's going on. Here, I don't know that you really can. You're along for the ride. And if you take the book in that kind of manner, it's a very enjoyable book of atmosphere and character. If you're trying to solve a mystery, you're going to wind up being frustrated because this is a Voynich manuscript of a book. There's just so many arcane little details. And it's not clear that you can actually solve it because new things are being introduced as well. This felt to me like a book to be experienced and enjoyed, and definitely that there is enjoyment to be had.
Yeah, and this was a book that I did not pick up. I had tried, which was the first book? Gideon the Ninth. I had tried that back when it had come out, and it just wasn't working for me. I didn't like the humor style or really the writing very much. So it's a kind of serious DNF, so I haven't read this, so it is going unranked. Then ranked at number 5 for me is Nettle and Bone by T. Kingfisher. So this is a short, sort of dark fantasy novel that is almost fairy tale-like in its story. And we follow a woman who basically lives in a convent, and she's there because her older sisters have been married off, and just to kind of get her out of the way and not threaten any lines of succession, she is in the convent, except that after a few years of her middle sister being married to the guy who her older sister was married to before, but her older sister died under mysterious circumstances, she is worried that something is going wrong. and that her sister is being mistreated, and decides that she needs to go and do something about this. And so she goes on this journey to try to gather the things that she would need in order to protect her sister. And this kind of, she ends up having a found family, picking out different people along the way, and she especially interacts with this older witch in order to try to gain some powers through some sacrifice. And I loved the beginning part of this book so much. The first third of this or so was just this beautiful dark fairy tale type of atmosphere as she's going and gathering these things through this witch, and it's just like it's very dark and very fairy tale like and has that classic feel, and I really loved it. But then the second half, when she's got her kind of group together, it changes pretty significantly in tone, and it gets a little silly for my taste. And T. Kingfisher has that humor style, which I think really jives with so many people, and sometimes it really works for me, and sometimes it just edges too far into silly. And that's what this one kind of did. And so it lost the atmosphere of the first part, which I loved, and went into a little bit more of the silliness, as well as like a light bit of romance, but I never really liked the way that Kingfisher writes romance, so that didn't work for me. And the ending, again, it was just a little off the wall, a little silly in the way that it happened. So even though there are some really interesting themes about domestic abuse and about also family planning and the kind of the way that childbearing and pregnancy can affect women and all these sorts of like really interesting themes, it just kind of lost me in the second half. So it was good, but it didn't end up being the favorite that I thought maybe it would be when I'd started it.
I'm pretty much in a similar boat, and one more thing I'd add here is that T. Kingfisher writes a number of stories where you have main characters that are not heroes, so to speak, right? You have certain flawed characters, like, and this one, for example, has a tendency towards negative self-talk. And basically, I think it's good to see characters out there also kind of having those kinds of issues that many of us have in real life. But I feel like sometimes it goes a little far further than is needed. And sometimes in trying to create a character who is maybe not that smart, and is engaging in negative self-talk, and there is a sort of a broader mystery kind of a thing of, it's like, how are we going to resolve this? And you see certain things way before the main character does, and she is berating herself about it. And that can be a little jarring. It can feel harsh, and like, I don't want to judge her that way. Come on, stop making me judge her that way, kind of that feeling you get. And so that can be a little jarring. The other aspect of it is, like you mentioned, after the team got put together, there's a quote that I kind of came across in the book, and it says something like, five of us is a fist, five is a hand on the enemy's throat. And, as inspiring as that sounds, I felt like they frequently had the hand on their own throat. Okay, they were on each other's, nerves a good amount of the time, and I kind of constantly warned of, saying things like, stop trying to be mean to Agnes. She's done nothing wrong. Be nice, and that sort of a thing to each other. It's like, those are the kinds of things. There's some amount of bickering that goes on and whatnot. That just was frustrating to read. I wish it had been a more positive experience in that sense. Next up, we have The Daughter of Dr. Moreau by Silvia Moreno-Garcia. This is loosely based on The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells. And basically, I almost didn't pick up this book because of that. The original is not a favorite of mine. And I feel like everything that the original did, Frankenstein did it better about 80 years before. And so it was one of those things of, I didn't really want to see a new version of that book exactly. But then, given that this got nominated for the Hugos, and given that I do really like Silvia Moreno-Garcia otherwise, I decided to pick it up. So basically, I think the way to think about this book is that it takes the island of Dr. Moreau and its themes and things like that, and then tries to think of the logistics around it. It's not that it's modernizing it exactly, but it's trying to think of, it's like, okay, but where would the doctor get his funding, and what would be required to keep this kind of an operation going on? And, it kind of does, it kind of like digs into a little bit more of that. And then it's like, okay, but what kind of strings would that entail? And like, what kind of control would that entail? why would these people care about doing these kinds of experiments? And, that sort of a idea. Well, in the original, there's this notion that there's an island where there's this disgraced scientist, Dr. Moreau, is locked away, and not locked away, he's here, he's by himself, but he's conducting a lot of experiments, vivisecting and kind of creating animal hybrids. Okay. Here, some of that has changed. Vivisection has gone away, and it's been replaced by genomics-based hybrid creation. And so there's some choices that are done. It is set in Mexico, in the Yucatan, and it is not in an island, but it is in a remote place. And he's being funded by people who are effectively hacienda owners, like plantation owners, so to speak. And it is set in a time where slavery is going out of fashion, so to speak, and it's very much treated in that kind of manner. And then trying to figure out, okay, how are we going to get labor? Okay, and they're like, oh, if we make animal hybrids, maybe that's a way to get labor. So it is framed in that kind of setting. So the original does a bunch of things of it's like, oh, but who are the monsters all along kind of a thing. In this book, there's no question about this. You know who the monsters are all along. And in fact, all the hybrids, so to speak, at no point of time do you feel revulsion or anything like that. You find them cute. You find them like a bunch of kids, and they're trying their best. There's no question of feeling threatened by the hybrids. I mean, at least you don't. You know that some people in the story do, but you don't. So there's that kind of a change, okay, in situation, if you will. There's also notions of, in the original, maybe there's some weird religious aspects that are introduced. I thought to kind of show that Dr. Moreau has his twisted understanding of religious teachings. Here, it's more on the lines of, no, but that is normal, and you should be questioning many structures of religion. So again, it's a slight shift in kind of how some things are situated. There are two viewpoint characters in this book. One is Montgomery, and another is Carlotta, the titular daughter of Dr. Moreau. And basically, Montgomery I found to be very uninteresting. He was this stoic, what do you say, I have ethics, but I'm going to drink my sorrows away, and then you can't really depend on me kind of character. I mean, that's probably really harsh, but I just was annoyed by him. So,
it's accurate.
So I would just found myself being really annoyed by him. I don't think his viewpoint character added that much to the story for me. Okay. Carlotta, on the other hand, is very interesting, and I think is one of the better pieces of character work I've seen, because she's kind of like, I think a lot of characters in stories equivalent to this will have a break point where they say, screw it, or they change how they perceive the world and then act on that perceived change. In Carlotta, you see the struggle between her kind of realizing certain things, figuring out what she ought to do, but then having that struggle versus what has been ingrained in her of what a young lady ought to do. And it's not like there's that flip switch moment. It's actually much more nuanced, and I really enjoyed that nuance. She's also kind of like a self-confessed romantic, but at the same time, she's also ruthlessly practical at certain times, but she's also really, really naive. And being naive and trying to be practical does not necessarily jive together. So in character work, I think that while there were many sections that were frequently frustrating to read because of that, I found the character work to be excellent. Overall, I think this book was a very interesting read. I think it was doing something interesting in trying to revisit Island of Dr. Moreau. But I think for me, my original stance of not picking up this book is probably what I would prefer to do. And it's kind of made me think about, if you really don't like a work and other works based on that, should you pick it up? And I'm now leaning more towards no.
Yeah. And I think that I haven't read The Isle of Dr. Moreau, so I didn't have that going in as a problem. And I just, in general, really enjoy Silvia Moreno-Garcia's takes on things. So I read this back when it came out, and I definitely enjoyed it. I think that just like she usually does, she situates this in Mexican history. And so it's very connected to what was going on in Mexico at the time, very connected to the place. You know, you really get this vivid sense of the Yucatan. And she has these interesting characters, often, you know, young women who are trying to grow up in some way or trying to self-actualize in some way. And I do think that Carlota is a very interesting character because she is somebody who is so used to just doing whatever her dad tells her to do and just falling in line and believing in what she's told. And she's kind of slowly coming to realize that maybe not everything that she's been brought up to believe in is right. And so that is a really interesting character journey. This book, I think, Montgomery was a little bit of a harder character to like, and I agree that he wasn't quite as engaging. I think also that the ending of this book gets quite a bit violent. I thought maybe there would be a lot of body horror going into this, but that was not the issue with this book for me. It was that the ending got a lot of action and a lot of violence, almost like I feel like there's some movies along this lines where, like westerns or something, where you just have a big shootout at the end, that kind of thing, and that was just too much for me. So I thought this was a good book, but definitely not quite my favorite by Silvia Moreno-Garcia, but still doing some interesting things. Then at number 3 is The Kaiju Preservation Society by John Scalzi. So this was such a fun book. Basically, it's about a character, Jamie, who loses their job right at the onset of the pandemic and ends up becoming, you know, a food delivery person, and is really struggling to get by and survive in the pandemic, and runs into an old, you know, friend that they knew, more of an acquaintance, who, after they get delivered food multiple times, kind of starts up a conversation about what Jamie's doing and would Jamie be interested in maybe joining his company. You know, they work on preserving large wildlife, and they've got great benefits, and it requires some, you know, time in the field separated from the rest of humanity, but it's interesting work. And Jamie thinks, you know what? I need something better than this, so sure. And joins only to discover that the large wildlife are kaiju, so think things like Godzilla, and that the in the field is basically an alternate reality, a different dimension of Earth, where rather than humanity evolving, kaiju evolved. And then we enter this like fantastical thing where Jamie's just learning about the kaiju at this base where there's all of these scientists who are studying the kaiju. There's tons of like, oh, this is cool kaiju world building facts, and lots of adventure and action and danger as they, you know, come close to these really very dangerous animals. And so this is like a fun book. It also just has a ton of humor, especially I would say the first third of the book has like a lot of really funny witty banter. I think, you know, just the world building in this is very cool, but it does fall down, especially in the second half for me. There's quite a lot of info dumping, throughout the whole book, and you just have characters who are having conversations that it's just basically world building being info dumped at you as the scientists discuss things, and that's not my favorite way to do things. I also think that the humor that was in the first part wasn't as present in the second half. It just focused more on action, and I liked the humor more. And the characters, while very funny, kind of all blended together in my mind, and so it didn't have necessarily a ton of distinct personalities. Some of them were very distinct, like there's a helicopter pilot in this who was my favorite character, but many other characters kind of blended together. So yeah, this was just a fun read for me.
Yeah, the thing about the same character, it was very much this kind of cheeky character. It's like, okay, cheeky character, but geophysicist. Cheeky character, but biologist. Cheeky character, but evil villain. It's like, it was the same character in many ways. You know, this is a fun popcorn read as I see it, and it was thoroughly enjoyable. I enjoyed reading it. But I don't think it's doing anything great, but sometimes this is what you need. You need that distraction kind of a thing. And so this is actually a book, despite me not rating it as highly as other books in this series, in this shortlist, I have wound up recommending to a couple of other people. So that's another thing. One more thing I did want to add about the cheeky aspect, and that is I have a quote from the book. Basically, it introduces a reverse lampshade notion. It's like, and the way it defines it is as follows. It's a literary term. It means calling attention to something improbable, acknowledging its improbability in the text, and then moving on. And one of the characters literally says this about why some explanation does not quite make sense. And it's like, no, don't worry, it makes sense. We move on. And then the example that I'll read out further in the book goes like this. I'm not sure how to describe the geometry that was involved in how a more than 100-meter tall creature maneuvered her head down close to our level, but it happened. It's like that's a lot of the kind of things that happen.
Yeah, and I will say that while this book didn't necessarily have, oodles of depth or anything like that, one of the things that I really liked is this is one of the few books that I've seen that actually really truly engages with the pandemic and with how that affected people and with how negatively, kind of the capitalist system affects all of these people who were just out of jobs or not able to make it. Jamie's original roommates were involved in theater, and of course everything shut down, and so I like that it actually did deal with that, but the way that it dealt with it was like, screw this, we're going to Kaiju Earth. And I kind of liked that. So I found some value in this in terms of what it's doing and what it's saying for this moment in time that I do think still makes it sort of Hugo worthy, even though it is just a very light and fun book. Then at number 2 in my ranking is The Spare Man by Mary Robinette Kowal. This is sort of a sci-fi detective mystery kind of suspense thriller that has a almost detective noir feel to it, but it's set in space. And I was very engaged in this as I was reading it. So we basically follow Tesla Crane, who is a scientist, and she is the heir to this huge kind of business of robotics and other things like that. So very rich, very powerful, very famous. And she's on her honeymoon with her husband, who is a newly retired detective. And on this cruise ship from Earth or the moon to Mars, there is a murder, and the onboard police sort of think that maybe her husband did it, and they arrest him, and she has to figure out how to clear his name, all while very dangerous things are going on. There's a lot of suspense and kind of thriller aspects to this. I found it really, really engaging. I was very much kind of page turning in this. I also thought that the world building was super cool. I loved all of the space bits that were worked into the story and how that affected things like the trajectory of a bullet and that kind of thing. That was integrated really well. I also really liked that the main character, Tesla Crane, is somebody who's dealing with PTSD and a pretty severe disability and kind of chronic pain. And so how she's managing that and how she's dealing with having limited mobility, as well as, her service dog in this, which is very much a part of the story. It's all very interesting. So I thought interesting things were happening. There were a couple of things that weren't my favorites. So Tesla Crane's personality was a little grating at times. She's very much the type of, I need to speak to the manager. And it's called out in the book, so it is acknowledged. But that kind of personality gets under your skin just a little bit as you read it. But I thought that it was just, a really engaging read that had cool world building and a good mystery, and I was just thoroughly engaged as I read it, so it was ranked pretty high for me.
So I went into this book knowing that this was, that Tesla Crane was has quite a privileged background, and there's a lot of the whole, I'd like to talk to your manager energy about this. But from the context, it was like, okay, no, you're on a honeymoon, your husband's been arrested on suspicion of murder, and you want to try to escalate or try and resolve things. That made sense to me. I was like, no, but that makes sense. It should be fine, right? And, and so basically I was like, that should be fine. But I was not prepared for the level of it. I was not prepared for the level of, I want to talk to your manager energy, the do you know who I am energy, and the, what do you say, am I being detained energy that went into this book. And after about 100 pages, I decided to call it. I DNF this book. And there's also one more aspect that kind of went into this, where the reading experience for me felt panic attack adjacent, and it was just like riding that, forefront of that wave. And I was like, I can't do this to myself. I need to stop reading it. And so I did. I stopped. So I don't have that much more to add. This was not a book for me.
Yeah, and I think that if you're somebody who doesn't like to read about anxiety and like really intense anxiety, then this is probably not the book for you. I don't struggle with that kind of anxiety, so it wasn't triggering for me, but she is definitely dealing with PTSD, and just, it's a lot. I think that in the book, it is very much used as amping up that sort of suspense and tension of the novel. But if that's like not something you want to read about, I would definitely stay away from this one. But for me, it kind of added to that engaging feel of it, but it was a little intense at times.
And finally, we have Legends and Lattes by Travis Baldree. This is my top ranked book. And basically, this is a cozy fantasy book with lit RPG adjacent elements. And basically, we follow this, orc fighter who decides that she wants to retire from adventuring, and she knows what she wants. She wants to go set up a cafe, and she's like, to make that happen, I need this, 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 and this. And in a dungeon run, when she finally achieves her last goal, she's like, okay, bye, I'm calling it quits, and then goes and tries to pursue her dream. This is a very slow, methodical, cozy read, and it's not that she has an easy time of just going and setting up a cafe and you just man the cafe sort of a thing. It's very much that she has to try and figure out, okay, what is this step take? What is this next step take? And then she finds a bunch of people to help her with various things. And it's not like the city is excellent. There are issues that happen and she has to deal with them. But where in many other books, those kinds of issues would be used to ramp up tension and increase tension, these are just seen as, okay, there's stuff that's going on. What can we do about it? And then it takes the slow, methodical route about it. And I think there's very much this notion of rebuilding yourself, rebuilding and being intentional about what it is that you're setting out to do, and then doing what you can do about that. And I felt like this was such a perfect book for the moment. I think that it taps into that stress and tiredness that a lot of us have been feeling in the last few years, and then saying, okay, but what would be nice? And this is escapism, but at the same time, it strengthens you a little bit. And I think this is doing something really interesting for the genre, and by establishing certain new norms around cozy writing. Or at least it's doing so by being as high profile as it is. I'm not saying this is the first book to necessarily do that. And so I thought this was a timely and very nice read.
Yeah, and I felt very similar about this. So I love cozy things, and this was one of my favorite fantasy books last year. It's just so gentle. The characters are very sweet. You have a found family where just there's like this very slow burn sapphic romance that's happening. There's a really adorable baker in this that's just so cute. I love books that talk about baking and describe food and drinks, and this one does a great job of that. And I just really got behind Viv's journey in trying to build this cafe and all of the steps that she was taking. I like things that are slice of life and slow in their approach, and it just really worked for me. I read this, and then later on I reread it out loud to Sush because I wanted to share it with him, and it was just as good on reread for me. I could see myself easily rereading this again just when I want something cozy and comforting. And it's just that feeling of, like Sush was saying, trying to realize your dreams, trying to reinvent yourself and become something that you can feel happy with. And again, it really fits the moment. Something cozy, talking about how do you want to change your life, that's all very timely right now. So yeah, I think that this was just a really sweet read and definitely ranked my number one out of this group of books. Okay, so those are all of our thoughts and rankings for the Hugo novels this year. It is very interesting just thinking about these books because a lot of them were written during the pandemic or, just right after the pandemic had started. And you can feel what a lot of the authors went through, and also just there weren't necessarily that many books published in 2022. So just seeing what was there and what were the themes and topics and types of books that happened in that year. It was very curious. So these are our thoughts and our rankings. If you guys have read any of these, if you have different thoughts, different rankings, go ahead and leave us a comment down below.